This video is brought to you in part by Encore. More on them in a bit. In late 1995, on the heels of the PlayStation's North American launch, Sony and 30 individual employees were sued for nearly $400 million by the nation's biggest independent game developer, the studio behind Madden Football, in one of the more insane and important stories in modern gaming history. And yet it's a story that hasn't properly been touched on in decades. Developer Park Place Productions alleged that Sony, who was publishing some of the studio's games, had engaged in a hostile takeover at the end of 1993. A New Year's Eve heist, stealing equipment, source code, those very employees, and even the studio's lawyer, which prevented them from suing right away. Mere days later, Sony opened the very first in-house PlayStation studio a few miles down the road, comprised exclusively of those former employees whom Sony had allegedly promised to protect from any legal pushback. Just about every PS1 game published by Sony's American branch passed through this fledgling studio in some form, and many of Sony Interactive's most consequential employees and projects joined as or came from part of this takeover. The minds behind one of the most influential MMOs of all time, Sony Computer Entertainment America's technology director for 20 years, the people who made the Neopets PS2 game.
I wasn't cut out to be a diplomat, Saradar.
Okay, maybe not that one, but to this day, even after renames and restructures, this San Diego studio exists as PlayStation's second longest running in-house team, fittingly still making sports games. All stretching back to, allegedly, the night that Sony stabbed right through the heart of the largest indie studio. But that's of course not the entire story, and it wasn't even the first time that Park Place Production had its talent poached from right under its nose. The company had a meteoric rise and fall in its short half-decade, with a monumental legacy that's been essentially stolen from it because, well, the victors write history. Park Place's execution with Madden just about single-handedly gave the Sega Genesis an inroad against Nintendo's vice grip on the American gaming market. It set the ground for the fiercest console wars and paved the way for the console landscape as we know it today. Park Place instantly became the go-to company for sports games in the era when sports games were often the graphical and technical powerhouses that sold systems in America. An era, by the way, they spawned. They began publishing in their own right, staffed up to over 130 people, opened the first video game soundstage for capturing real-life motion and putting it into a game, and were simultaneously developing almost 50 games for over a dozen different publishers, including making football and other sports titles for EA, Konami, Acclaim, and Sony. Then, within 3 years of Madden Football's 1990 console release, they were gone. So, what happened? From allegations of gross incompetence and nepotism to tales of the studio hyping up its all-star talent when talking to publishers, only to have fresh rookies actually be the ones sleeping in office bunk beds to make the games, robbing Peter to pay Paul, all the way to religious visions of God informing Park Place's founder how to run the studio. I think the better question is, what didn't happen? What sounds at first like a cut-and-dry tale of a smaller company getting beaten down by a Goliath corporation may end up feeling closer to that Goliath acting opportunistically for its own interests, but also as a life raft for developers when they suddenly stopped getting paychecks right during the holidays and the boat was capsizing. This is the story of PlayStation's longest-running American studio, of the underdog Madden developer that changed the landscape in more ways than it would ever live to see, and of the murky split between the two that influenced the subsequent 30 years of PlayStation history. Now, this is not a video about the Madden games, but to dig into Park Place, we do have to briefly dig into the equally crazy story of the multiple first Maddens that exist. Electronic Arts founder Trip Hawkins had signed the titular NFL coach to a licensing agreement in 1984, hoping to create a detailed, physics-based football simulator. This game would release 4 years later on the Apple II computer, after a lengthy period of development hell due to technical limitations clashing with John Madden's insistence that the game feature a full 22 players on the field at all times. Famously, this game was internally referred to as Trip's Folly. During production, though, EA had also contracted a small studio named Bethesda to develop a game called Madden, Bethesda's second ever game, a sort of sequel to their 1986 debut Gridiron. You have to say it like that due to the exclamation point. Gridiron! Bethesda's Madden never released, and the developer sued EA under suspicion that the latter had only courted them to steal Bethesda's physics code. The 1988 Madden was not financially successful, sometimes considered too much of a simulation and not necessarily all that fun at all. In fact, it was overshadowed that year by multiple other football titles on the PC market, including one that incidentally featured a fictional John Madden parody. Around this time, EA had begun exploring the idea of bringing its games to the console market thanks to the looming Sega Genesis. See, Nintendo's strict publisher fees, control over the manufacturing of its cartridges, and the lockout chip designed to prevent unauthorized carts meant that there was no negotiating, that breaking these terms meant years racking up legal fees, and that the profit margins were slim. Tripp didn't want to play that ballgame. Sega had plans for lower but still significant fees, but it didn't implement a physical lockout chip, which opened the opportunity for EA to completely reverse engineer a development kit and produce its own cartridges. Some of you may know that similar attempts had been made by other companies with the NES that were still being litigated at this time, and Sega later unsuccessfully sued a different publisher for this same style of reverse engineering. EA had just gotten there first and happened to cut a deal. There are multiple versions of this next part that seem to change depending on who's doing the talking and if they want to make it seem more contentious. Even when the same person's doing the talking, it often changes for drama. Some retellings say there was a legal standoff where Sega and EA both gambled on threats knowing that a court battle would ruin both of them. Others paint it more amicably rather than a last-second deal, but in either case, Sega agreed to EA's request for a cheaper licensing fee, $2 per cartridge instead of about $10. And they got a hard cap on the total cost that would eventually save EA tens of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, EA had already contracted Park Place Productions to develop Madden from the ground up for the Genesis, using their own instruction manual for their reverse-engineered dev kit. Park Place had found success right away upon its founding in 1989 thanks to their Monday Night Football game, and in fact, much of the staff, including founder Mike Knox, worked on that aforementioned football game that had the exaggerated Madden lookalike, which had reviewed favorably when put up next to the real Madden. Those games took a less simulation-based approach, focusing on a semi-realistic, at the time, but more entertaining arcade-styled hybrid. This, Trip Hawkins figured, was what players would really want, rather than the detailed sims that he personally loved. So through a mutual connection, he reached out to one of Park Place's other founders, Troy Linden. When Tripp first met with Knox and Linden, he asked them point blank, "Are you going to make the game I want to make, or the game you want to make?" Knox answered with the latter, which was what Tripp was hoping to hear. Linden hired one of his high school pals, sound designer Jim Simmons, to handle much of the programming work. Hiring somebody for this who had little programming experience greatly confused some colleagues, until Simmons, almost overnight, on a fake Genesis, figured out how to skew the game's top-down perspective for a pseudo-3D view. This shift in perspective alone would bring the game to life. It would be Madden's killer selling point, to say nothing about the 100+ plays in the game designed with Madden's direct input. The last nugget here is that near the end of Madden's production, Sega had found out that its own football game, starring quarterback Joe Montana, had just not been made. Developer Mediagenic, also known as Activision, had lied to Sega for months about its progress, while that company was in mayhem behind the scenes. So with only 2 months before Christmas and no game to show for it, Sega first tried pitching EA on dropping their Madden license, turning their game into Joe Montana football instead. Hawkins chimed back with an offer to have Park Place secretly make both Madden and Joe Montana, not telling Sega that they would intentionally make Sega's version worse by removing features like that angled field view and 100+ plays. Madden would make its release before Christmas 1990. Joe Montana mysteriously slipped into early 1991. With almost 500,000 sales right out of the gate, the work of EA and Park Place genuinely played a significant hand in further shifting the perception of video games, thanks to its appeal to a much wider market that would previously probably have made fun of games for being more of a children's fad. This played perfectly with Sega of America's strategy of painting Nintendo as the kiddie market and highlighting itself as the mature system for teens and young adults, and Madden gave the Genesis a true killer app ahead of Sonic's 1991 debut. Now, I want to note that there are several other names involved that had significant contributions to what make Madden work, both this game and the series as a whole. In recent years, these folks on the EA side of production, or the folks that would later leave Park Place to work directly with EA, they've been highlighted more and painted as the superstars, while Park Place has been marginalized or outright cut out of this story. This fact is a key part of Park Place's own tale, and that's the focus of this video, not EA. Now, the two replicated Madden's success with summer 1991's NHL Hockey, a game that, unlike most sports titles at the time, had an actual license from the league to use team names, instead of just slapping a famous athlete or coach on the box and using legally distinct but often identical teams. This may well have been the first game to utilize a custom soundstage for filming and scanning real player movements, one of Park Place's new ventures in its rapid expansion. Throughout this, they collaborated once again on Madden 92, taking the gamble that this new market of die-hard sports fans would be willing to buy a roster update year after year, especially if they added at least one killer innovation each go. In 92's case, the game implemented instant replay. While we're talking about this sort of annual encore, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Encore. Encore's a new marketplace to learn about and shop for video games, collectibles, and more. Now, if you're here, odds are you've picked up at least one retro game from similar sites, and you've dealt with listings full of stock images or bad lighting or angles that obscure some sort of issue with the box or game itself. We all know it's a minefield to deal with, especially when those sites make it hard to get support if you've got an issue. What's cool about Encore isn't just its emphasis on trust or its guarantee that protects you if you do run into an issue, it's that the app requires verification from sellers and full videos on every single item so that you can see every detail of what you're shopping for better than anywhere else. Here in the live auctions, you can type in the chat and ask questions in real time before making a bid, or you of course can check out the buy now section so there's less pressure. What's better is there are even a ton of free giveaways in the app. Encore pays the shipping on every giveaway, so it's truly free for you, and if you want some extra entries, you can nudge some friends to sign up as well. Just use my link first, of course. So if you want to start winning some cool deals on games, consoles, whatever floats your boat, use my link to download Encore's app today. Thanks again to Encore for reaching out and sponsoring, and now, back to the video. Around this point, however, EA hired that programmer Jim Simmons away from Park Place, and according to Knox, bought out the studio's rights to the Madden games in 1993. Knox agreed, taking a further gamble that since almost no games at the time had ever made it past 2 sequels, Madden was eventually destined to fall off. Allegedly, 10 years later, an EA employee told him that they were still using remnants of these Genesis games in Madden 03 and beyond. After working together on 1992's hockey game, EA took the talent it wanted with it and parted ways with Park Place. Although, according to Knox, they developed Madden 93 as well. If this is the case, they and any employees therein are not credited in any capacity, and in other interviews, Knox's recollections were questionable at best, such as when he took credit for personally asking John Madden to be in the game and reviving Madden's image as a football genius, even though there's hard evidence that EA had been working with him for years before that. Or when he suggested that Sega of America threatened to pull the entire Genesis system from its 1990 release date if EA didn't agree to make the Joe Montana game. The Genesis had been out for a year already. Anyway, regardless of when EA and Park Place split, it wasn't a massive blow to the rapidly expanding developer, as they were quickly contacted by other publishers like Virgin Interactive, Konami, and Acclaim looking to make inroads in the sports game bubble. By mid-1993, they'd even signed on to produce sports titles for Trip Hawkins' new console, the 3DO. With all these games in production came the need to hire new staff, especially to replace invaluable talent like Simmons. As the front-facing founders, Knox and Linden enjoyed accolades like being named Inc. magazine's Entrepreneur of the Year, the cracks were already forming below. Now, what's notable is that due to the studio's success, it had negotiated an unusual perk as a developer. Park Place had been able to maintain the rights to reuse assets and source code from these titles, regardless of if they then used them for direct competitors. This meant that as they developed games like ESPN's National Hockey Night for publisher Sony ImageSoft, they were repurposing and iterating on their work, sometimes using the same sprites. In fact, Park Place was working simultaneously on 2 hockey games for different publishers, where innovations in one game, like a different camera perspective, were only implemented so that they could be repurposed for the other. That second game, Road to the Cup Hockey 94, never made it far in production. The team had missed milestone deadlines and went over budget, with the publisher then refusing to pay any more than they'd allotted. According to multiple Park Place programmers, management aimed for the lowest bid to secure every possible contract, which often meant promising faster schedules than was ever going to be feasible. One of these coders talked about the 80-hour work weeks, how programmers kept a sleeping bag at their desk, a lot of crunch culture things that you've probably heard time and again in game development, and then he talked about the official office company bunk beds. I'm hoping that was a joke. While other employees after the company's collapse stated that they loved their time with the studio during its early years, even up to the final weeks, this constant crunch appears to have been the reality company-wide by 1993. Although the founders touted that it was working simultaneously on 45 games for over a dozen publishers, it only released 24 games total, technically fewer. The apparent inability to turn down any contract was perhaps them digging a deeper hole just out of necessity, with the upfront funding from Game A actually being used to finish the behind-schedule Game B. ESPN's representative at the time said that he loved both founders, but that their business acumen was not on par with their software expertise. Considering the company was founded using $3,000 from Knox's credit cards rather than any sort of business loan, that's probably a fair assessment. This is where Sony comes back into the picture. Now, these few years of Sony's pre-PlayStation planning history are a web in their own right that's never fully been untangled and properly presented in one easily absorbable place. Definitely not related to that sentence, you should subscribe. For this story, there are two important parts of that web. A, keep in mind that the entire PlayStation ecosystem exists out of spite. Sony's Japanese executives didn't want to produce a system, thinking of games as a toy that would devalue the company. It's only thanks to a few people working in secret that it happened at all, and it's only after publicly announcing their Nintendo partnership and Nintendo the next day revealing that it would instead work with Philips that they furiously got to work. And B, Sony's leadership groups, like Sega and Nintendo before it, were geographically autonomous for much of PlayStation's history. Sony's American, European, and Japanese divisions operated semi-independently at this point. In fact, what would later be known as Sony Computer Entertainment America actually founded its European sibling. In May 1993, specifically Sony's American subsidiary purchased an ownership stake in veteran British developer Psygnosis, making it the first PlayStation studio before there even was a PlayStation studio. Due to its experience with CD-based game production and helping convince Sony Japan to go with an accessible PC-based development kit, Psygnosis played a crucial and underappreciated role in the system's success. Until it was fully acquired at the end of the decade, it still operated semi-independently, even of Sony Europe though, another example of this regional autonomy. Many, if not most, PS1 exclusives were published in Europe by them instead of by Sony, leading to Psygnosis accounting for 40% of 1995's total game sales in all of Europe. Each region having its own priorities like this is what led to Sony ImageSoft working with Park Place, realizing that in the American game market, you needed your console to have sports games, especially if you're touting the jump to 3D. With EA having no reason to leave multi-platform, and with Park Place's purported experience, it was a no-brainer. There really was no other option. As Park Place's issues mounted though, and deadline after deadline passed with no updates, publishers were under no obligation to pay at each milestone. Some started pulling out entirely by the end of 1993. Whatever veil Park Place had that masked its dire state had been shredded. Founder Troy Linden suddenly left the company on dour terms, with he and former friend Mike Knox now blaming one another for all of the tight timelines. Some publishers sued for breach of contract, others found new developers to take over their productions. Just 3 years prior, Park Place had replaced a chaotic studio and made Joe Montana Football. Now, the chaotic Park Place was being replaced by Acclaim, who had to find a new developer for its NFL Quarterback Club series. This is where, according to former employees, things got weird. As staff began to worry about whether they'd get paid, Knox's father, also an employee, quipped that he was expecting a miracle from God that would deliver them the money they needed. Another former employee noted that Knox started sharing his religious dreams, saying that the Lord was guiding him in running Park Place. Knox allegedly began acting more erratically, at one point suddenly firing all but 3 members of Park Place's marketing team, those 3 being his family. Knox's lawyer later suggested that if all of Park Place's publishing partners just paid what they owed for games that Park Place had breached contract by not delivering, if they just paid up, the company would be fine and it's their fault that things are bad. Perhaps out of self-preservation, knowing that not delivering the ESPN games would put them in a rough spot ahead of the just-announced PlayStation, or perhaps more likely seeing an opportunity, Sony America stepped in, offering to help right the ship and sort out the remaining contract issues, with the caveat that Knox had to sell a controlling stake to them. Knox refused. On Thursday, December 30th, 1993, mere months after he was awarded Entrepreneur of the Year, Knox had to tell over 100 staffers that they wouldn't be getting paid and that the company was immediately restructuring. However, if they wanted to keep working, they could for free. He would try to get them paid eventually. On Monday, January 3rd, 1994, Sony opened a brand new game development office just down the street, its first fully owned in-house studio. About 30 people worked there at the time, every one of them formerly from Park Place, and they began working on the very same ESPN sports games that Sony had been paying Park Place to produce. What happened over that New Year's Eve weekend? According to some, Sony recruited a few Park Placers, including the company's own lawyer, to give a godfather offer to a few dozen of the ESPN games developers in a secret meeting. That offer? There's a job opening at Sony ImageSoft if you agree right now, give no advance notice to Park Place, and bring your work with you. Others suggested that there wasn't an ultimatum at all, that once the checks stopped clearing, knowing that Knox had been openly boasting about being in a standoff with Sony about a buyout, a few Park Place employees independently rushed to try and secure jobs with Sony for themselves and at least some of their teammates. Plus, they noted, several more coworkers had joined well after that supposed decide now demand that may or may not have existed. Were we rats leaving a sinking ship? I guess you could say that, but then it isn't just the rats that leave a sinking ship, it's anyone who wants to stay alive. Sony's official comment was that their new employees had already quit and, quote, Sony was fortunate enough to be able to hire them, end quote. The timelines vary a bit too, with some sources saying that these 30 employees had quit on December 27th after checks started bouncing. Others, including Knox, suggest that the mass resignation happened the very same day that Sony's new office opened. Knox, through a new lawyer who publicly called him naive while defending him, implied that Sony had convinced some of Park Place's other publishers to stop paying the studio in order to buy it for cheap. In the same breath, he admitted those other publishers had also offered to buy the company at different points during the months leading up to Park Place's collapse. As for the staffers bringing their work with them all the way down to the source code, a contemporary article notes that many former Park Place employees were also suing Knox for back pay, and that those programmers might have a case in taking their work in lieu of the payments that they knew would never come. Those ESPN games actually did release throughout 1994, though not on the now looming PS1. That would come soon after. Park Place was still credited for each on its work, too, some of the final games the studio would technically make, even though in this case, it no longer produced the games. Right as the PlayStation was dropping in Japan, ESPN National Hockey Night was first gracing the Super Nintendo, the same system that had incidentally spawned the PlayStation to begin with, due to Nintendo fearing being out-Nintendoed by Sony's restrictive licensing demands. Much of 1994 for Knox was spent putting back together whatever pieces of Park Place were left, dealing with lawsuits from at least one former publisher, almost losing to a default judgment because he didn't respond in time, which he attributed to the company's lawyer having gone to Sony during the lawsuit. He alleged that by mid-1994, the amount of ex-Park Placers at this Sony studio was now 50 plus. It wasn't until November 1995, just 2 months after the PS1's Western launch, that he filed suit against both Sony and those 30 employees that had jumped ship. Citing over $2 million in supposed lost revenue, he sued for $90 million, with an additional $300 million in punitive damages. He made further headlines 12 months later by taking this lawsuit to the press, and by this point, Park Place's alleged count of games developed was now somehow being claimed as 70 plus. That makes me think that they had to be inflating that number by including every single console and handheld version of the game separately, possibly including ones they also still didn't develop to begin with. That and/or Knox and his new legal team were counting every single contract they had signed as another 1+ games in the portfolio. My favorite part about this is that at the time of recording, Knox's former co-founder Troy Linden has 4 different websites that use 2 different sets of numbers to describe the number of games and publishing partners that Park Place had. It would be 5 websites, but his .org seems to have expired in the last few weeks. If you're wondering why he has 5 very slightly different websites and some other brand pages that cover the entire front page of his search results instead of redirecting all of that to one hub, one could theorize that it might have something to do with the US government's multi-million-dollar securities fraud lawsuit against him, which happens to be buried on page 2. I'm not saying that, but one could. Whatever the case, subsequent details involving the Park Place lawsuit have never come to light. It's entirely possible that Sony offered some sort of settlement just to bury the headline, or that it was privately dismissed. Knox's own job listings mark 1995 as the final year that Park Place existed, and show him bouncing around other jobs about once a year after that. He even made a rap song about the Iraq War.
Enron, its executives fooled the SEC and destroyed the life savings of retirees on 9/11.
Troy Linden, after leaving Park Place, eventually found his way into making Bible video games, among other ventures. This is where their side of the story ends, but the PlayStation was just getting started, and the ripple effect from this alleged hostile corporate takeover of Park Place's employees would help define PlayStation's American footprint for console generations to come. Although not everyone joined and not everyone stayed, this team, after finishing Park Place's ESPN games, would fold into that Sony ImageSoft publishing label, now renamed to Sony Interactive Studios America. Their first project was ESPN Extreme Games, a middling PS1 launch title that fulfilled the rest of Sony's ESPN obligations. My hunch is that Sony was aiming to utilize the ESPN branding for more of its sports games, but Disney's 1996 purchase of the network put that to rest. Later renamed to One Extreme, just about every credited employee on this game worked on those Park Place games, and several of them are named directly in the lawsuit. The first true hit came in December though, thanks to some incredible luck that takes us back to EA. Sony launched its sports series with NFL Game Day, the PlayStation's own fully three-dimensional answer to Madden. Except it didn't have to answer, because Game Day ran unopposed. Although Madden 96 released on the now last-gen consoles, the team couldn't successfully set up a true 3D experience while working on those 2.5D ones for a console that was so new in a language in which they'd never coded. Rather than miss the holiday sales, EA canceled it and subsequently dropped that team, Visual Concepts, who would later be acquired by Sega to make sports titles for the Dreamcast and make essentially every single game with 2K in the title since. So between the lack of competition and a strong marketing campaign, Sony's sports studio had found immediate success in a crucial market. And first-party success at that, on a system whose truly in-house successes can otherwise be counted on two hands. They followed this by releasing NHL Face-Off a few weeks later, another game that achieved acclaim, and from there, the floodgates opened. In '96, the studio added college football and the MLB to its slate, although funnily enough, that much-delayed baseball game ended up being by far the worst reviewed. Remember, sports games became a pillar of American game sales after Madden, and especially in the era before sports licenses all congealed into one publisher each, your console's exclusive sports games were your way of showcasing what the hardware could do. Each of these games featured some or many of these former Park Placers, in addition to a growing slate of new hires. At a point, the bloat began to set in from working on 4 sports franchises a year, later 5 when they took over Sony's NBA Shootout series from Sony Europe, and it actually got even bigger from there when they added a second NFL series later on. Not to mention a whole other slate of games being handled by this studio, and the other half of Sony Interactive that was in the building doing its own thing, handling producer duties on Twisted Metal, Jet Moto, Warhawk, and more. From 1995 to 1998, they directly developed 16 games, and anything that wasn't a sports or racing game was bad. I'm talking Spawn and Blasto levels of bad. To mitigate this bloat, by 1997, as part of a global restructure, SCE America had started forking these teams off to pursue their own specific needs. Often these studios were second party and later rebought and merged into PlayStation because the PlayStation production ecosystem was still modeling itself after Sony Music and having in-house producers at Sony work with technically outside teams. The sports label remained in-house though, and it was moved entirely to LA, named 989 Studios, and only worked on sports games from here, with the exception of the hastily made Twisted Metals 3 and 4. However, many of these games were co-produced in San Diego by a spin-off studio, founded by the folks that didn't want to move to LA during the transition, including this studio's founder and ex-Park Placer. When Sony formally purchased and reabsorbed this team, it became San Diego Studio, and with EA having gobbled up NFL exclusivity in 2005, 989 was reabsorbed fully back into San Diego. Some of the earliest employees on Sony's PS1 sports titles still work at San Diego Studio today on MLB The Show, the only MLB game left in town. If you follow this lineage all the way back to that 1994 founding, it's the second longest tenured member of the PlayStation family. The longest is Polyphony, who was technically making Gran Turismo before there even was a PlayStation, with a group of Sony Music Japan employees developing it in secret since 1992. And to be clear, that lineage isn't just me connecting studios in some sort of roundabout way. A longtime technology director at SCEA mentions leaving Park Place to found San Diego studio in '93. It's just that the names had changed over time. Let's return to that 989 studio split in 1997. Ex-Park Place employee John Smedley was given the reins on an online RPG project, taking 55 folks with him. This studio, technically a second-party one working with Sony Online Entertainment, would release EverQuest in 1999, one of the most influential MMOs of all time. Sony quickly reacquired this team as they expanded into other MMOs like PlanetSide and Star Wars Galaxies. Smedley and some of the other named parties in the Park Place lawsuit, Andrew Zaffron and Russell Shanks, would continue in major roles at Sony Online Entertainment for over a decade before Sony eventually sold the studio off. Similarly, when fellow ex-Park Placer Mark Lyons moved to Colorado, he founded Idle Minds, who would continue developing games almost exclusively for PlayStation for several years. Some of their work includes the later Cool Borders games, that Neopets game that I mentioned earlier, PS3 download title Pain, which was briefly the most downloaded game on PSN, and the Ratchet & Clank HD collection. This studio now operates as Deck 9, producing many of the Life is Strange games. Several more Park Placers became longtime producers at Sony, helping greenlight and support just about any of your favorite American-made PlayStation games up through the PS3 era at least, if not longer. And of course, there are even more folks that supposedly left Park Place for Sony than were named in Michael Knox's lawsuit. Perhaps most important, having a proper in-house developer during the PlayStation's teething period, in addition to the producers that were supervising external projects, helped prepare Sony Computer Entertainment America for the future. It's no coincidence that Sony tapped Alan Becker to oversee the founding of its Santa Monica studio after he had been on site and seen all of these growing pains of having so many teams and sub-teams working under one messy roof. After all, that Nintendo EAD strategy has just about never been replicated at scale. I mean, look at Japan Studio. It already took the PlayStation side of Sony 15 or so years to start figuring out what it was going to be, its brand-wide identity, after having leaned so heavily on third-party developers time and again that their internal stuff sometimes struggled to sell and connect with fans. Without this head start of sorts, there's a chance that Sony's American branch might have fallen behind the tech curve with no infrastructure in place to help studios out, similar to the struggles that befell the Japanese side that ended up being comprised of Sony Music employees and people learning how to make games on the job. So somehow, this video might actually understate the long-tail impact of Sony absorbing those Park Place employees when they did. But was all of it due to a shrewd business move mixed with good fortune that Sony's American team just happened to work with a developer that was on the edge of collapse? Or did the massive corporation steal the legs out from under the little guy and find a way to turn a hostile takeover into a foundational piece of a 30-year, multi-billion-dollar empire? For my money, good bit of both. To quote one industry insider commenting in 1994, "I don't like what Sony did, but Park Place had it coming." Many Park Place employees said outright that Sony never necessarily lured people away. People were just looking for work, and Sony made some space. But it is a little convenient that an at-the-time New York-based division was either sitting on an empty office space in San Diego, just waiting, or was able to secure one over a holiday weekend, isn't it? Thanks for watching, make sure to subscribe and all that fun stuff, and until next time, stay golden. A massive thanks to all my wonderful supporters for making these videos possible. If you want early or ad-free videos, bonus content, access to the Golden Cult Discord server, and much more, check out the Patreon or hit join here on YouTube. A special shout out to the special golden folks who go above and beyond, like Alexander Sherbula, Koiti Allen, Jump Rock, Mason Hunt, Goldstorm07, Tabriz Sadiq, The Critic of Innocence, and Thomas Kuzma. Thank you.